Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Art of Catholic. Once again, I have with me today a very special guest. I have Dr. Jay Richards, who is an assistant research professor at the Busch School of Business at Catholic University of America. He's also a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute and the executive editor of The Stream. And if you haven't checked out The Stream, you should check that out online. Now, he's the author of more than a dozen books, including New York Times bestsellers Infiltrated back in 2013, Indivisible in 2012, Money, Greed, and God, which actually won a 2010 Templeton Enterprise Award. Now, his newest book is The Human Advantage, The Future of American Work in the Age of Smart Machines. You can find all of those on Amazon. And he's got a new book coming out on fasting as well. You can pre-order that right now, depending on when it is you watch this. Now, he's also the creator and executive producer of several documentaries, including 3 that have appeared widely on PBS, which is a feat in and of itself. His latest articles and essays, all of them, have been published in the Harvard Business Review. He's been on the Wall Street Journal. He's been in Barron's, Washington Post, Forbes, Fox News, Natural Review Online. I could go on and on and on. It's a long, very illustrious list, depending on your definition of illustrious, of all the places where Jay has appeared. He's a really brilliant guy. I'm super happy to have him on The Art of Catholic. Dr. Jay Richards, welcome to The Art of Catholic podcast.
It's great to be with you.
You know, you and I go back a long way. We've known each other. In fact, it was our mutual friend, Michael Miller, who introduced us back in the day. And I've had Michael on this program before. But our paths don't cross all that often on the road. We see each other every now and then. And some of my audience members may not be aware of who you are. So I just want to start there a little bit. Just, what's your background? You're a convert like me, and from a Calvinist background as well. Share with us a little bit about that.
Yeah.
And just who you are and what you're about.
Absolutely. It's funny. In fact, I think Matthew, that you sort of played a role when my wife and I entered the church a little over 10 years ago, and I was sort of farther along the journey. I had been born and raised in the Presbyterian church, in a kind of mainline Presbyterian church, had become really a convinced evangelical in college, but was basically reformed in theology. And my wife had grown up in a Wesleyan evangelical household, and so we had gone to a variety of evangelical, mostly Presbyterian churches since we had been married. And I, over a sort of long period of time, had been studying theological questions and made a list of what I called intellectual impediments to being Catholic. And I just thought, I'm going to study these issues on both sides with no intention of becoming Catholic. I just felt like I need to get over the kind of unnuanced presentations of Catholic views that you get, in Reformed circles. And so I put canonization and authority and the real presence at the top of the list. And it goes on from there. And then I stuck the Marian dogmas down at the bottom because I'm never getting to the Assumption of Mary, what is that? But honestly, I did my best to try to read around the subjects, and canonization and authority, I really thought it was a knockdown, drag-out argument in which the Catholic side won, honestly, and confirmed my suspicion that Luther had basically thrown out the books of the Bible that he didn't like. And then when I got the real presence and really studied the Church Fathers and did careful exegesis, I just became convinced that, okay, look, this is quite justified biblically. It's what all the Christians believed. It's kind of absurd that we should decide we understand better, 1,500 years later. It took me a while to actually come around to the question of whether I believed it, but I eventually did. I just found myself believing it at one point. But my wife wasn't sort of doing the same thing. And what's funny is I thought, it can't be my job to try to persuade her. Just didn't feel right. But I think it's because of Michael Miller. She ended up talking to you, whom you didn't know her from Adam. We knew each other. And it was an amazing conversation. And I joke, I said, yeah, you were one Scott Hahn book and a conversation with Matthew Leonard away from being Catholic for years. I just didn't know it. And so I've been at Catholic University now. I'm in my 6th year, and we've been Catholic since Easter Vigil, so a little over 10 years ago, actually. Fantastic. And it's been great. It's funny because the day that we entered the church, one of my good Catholic friends actually sent me an email, and he said, now our problems are your problems too. So,
well, speaking of those problems, let's jump into this because, I mentioned Well, I did not mention this book. This is one of the books that you have contributed to. I'm going to make sure I get this up there. This is called God and Evolution, and you were the editor of this, and you've contributed several essays to this. And I made it through a good portion of your essays in this book, and it's extremely impressive, and it's why I wanted to have you on the program. And I wanted to get into this because there's a lot of confusion with regard, not just to Catholics, but in the Christian world in general.
Sure.
On the relationship of God and the world, or maybe a better way to put it is the relationship between faith and science, to put it maybe in more modern vernacular. And that seems a little heady on one level, but the ripple effects across, our worldview and how we think about all kinds of things it's real, and it really affects how it is we think about a lot of different things. So why don't we start there? What's the relationship between faith and science, especially from a Catholic perspective?
Well, from the Catholic perspective, faith and reason itself, at least, are supposed to go together. And in fact, John Paul, a little over, 20 years ago, now 21 years ago, had an encyclical on this in which he defended, first of all, the kind of robustness and the reasonableness of faith and of revelation, but also of science. But he and then Pope Benedict were very clear to say that, look, now, when we're talking about natural science and the study of the natural world, that doesn't absorb reason. In fact, what we want is a broad understanding of reason that allows us to think about the things of God, to think about history and philosophy, and also science, as opposed to collapsing reason down into, say, some narrow materialistic 19th century understanding of science. That's the problem that we deal with, though, at the beginning of the 21st century, is that science, which really it's just from the word scientia, meaning wisdom, has gotten conflated, and this really happened in the 19th century, into a particular kind of materialistic way of understanding reason, so that only things that can be tested in a lab, essentially, a chemistry lab, are subject to reason and can be thought reasonable. So there's no kind of public knowledge of moral truths or anything like that. And so we're sort of constantly now, I think, as Catholics, on the one hand, defending reason. In fact, I think we may be the last ones to defend reason against the relativists, sure, while also saying reason is not restricted to an overly limited understanding of the empirical sciences. The empirical sciences are very important, but they need to take place in a kind of wider context. And because we've got all these complicated cross currents, it's no wonder that we tend to get confused when it comes to talking about a question such as biological evolution, in which you're not just talking about science, but you're talking about a sort of subdomain of science in which philosophy and theology and particular metaphysical assumptions work their way deeply, often into the content of science, so that faithful Catholics have a hard time, on one hand, saying, okay, what does the evidence really say? And then also, what does the church really say about this stuff?
Yeah, and I've been confused on this. Well, I was confused on this for a long time. And as a Calvinist kid growing up, and not just Calvinism, but just even in the evangelical circles that I was running in, I was taught to be a young earth creationist, which in other words, 6 literal 24-hour days, because that's what the book of Genesis says. And if you don't believe that, you're going to go to hell, because we interpret everything literally except for John chapter 6. So, that was the point of view that I had, even as I was entering into the church. And then I discovered a far more nuanced version of what it is I could believe with regard to how the world came to be when I became Catholic. But what are the predominant views these days of how the world came into existence?
Well, at least among Christians, as you said, the first one is what we'll just call young earth creationism. And I would say this is not reading Genesis 1 literally so much as saying those days of Genesis are 24-hour earth days. Because, of course, if you look at the text, it doesn't say 6 24-hour earth days. It just says day and night. The sun and the moon, in fact, show up on day 4. God creates the light, separates it from the darkness. He rests on a day 7 that doesn't come to an end. So I think if you read the text carefully, it sort of suggests these days, whatever they are of God's, are not regular 24-hour earth days like we have. But many Christians, and especially Protestant evangelical Christians, I wouldn't say necessarily the majority view, but probably half of evangelicals maybe hold this view, which is that the earth is the universe is no more than 10,000 years old, and God did all of his creative activity in 6 24-hour earth days, essentially, at the beginning of all things. Now so let's call that young Earth creationism. There are a few Catholics that also hold this view. I know a couple of them, but it's an extreme minority view. And then there's something that is generally called old Earth creationism, which is just basically is the idea that, okay, yeah, there's good evidence for the general geological ages of the Earth, and the standard understanding of the age of the universe is, maybe 13.8 billion years. There are lots of natural processes that work. God doesn't do everything directly. And in fact, no Christians think that. We know that God creates laws and things, that nature has its own capacities, but that God also acts directly at different times in history to do special things. So maybe, of course, the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of the first human couple, things like that. So God both creates the world, he sustains it, he can work through secondary causes, and then he can also act directly. But the kind of standard ages of things are accepted. And then there's a third view that we'll just kind of broadly call theistic evolution, which I think is more accurately called theistic Darwinism, which just basically says not only all of those kind of standard cosmic ages are correct, but the Darwinian account of biological evolution is true, more or less. But nevertheless, God kind of secretly behind the scenes somehow orchestrated things. And so then you can say, so I just think God's way of creating is by using evolution. God created using evolution, by which we mean Darwinian evolution. And then that looks like, to a lot of people, especially a lot of Christian academics, like, okay, that solves all the intellectual problems because now I don't have to worry about arguing with my Darwinian colleagues. And so there's a real temptation toward that view. Now, I myself, just a thing I didn't mention about my background is I've been skeptical of Darwinian claims on empirical grounds for a couple of decades. I've been affiliated with the Discovery Institute and have been a positive advocate and defender of the idea of intelligent design. That is, that there's real observable evidence of purpose and design in the universe. And so, though I don't think theologically we can sort of say for sure one way or the other about how the universe is, I think we should use both our faith and our reason and decide, okay, what is a kind of core claim of the faith and what is a secondary question? And then what does the scientific evidence really say? We don't want to hastily accommodate Darwinian evolution in particular without actually looking at the evidence. One, because I think the evidence ends up being lacking when you look at it, except for sort of in limited applications. And then secondly, it has much more profound philosophical and theological implications than, say, the claim that the universe is 13 billion years old. It's just, it's order of magnitude kind of different thing. And so we want to be careful the kinds of things that we accommodate. And in particular, I think Darwinian evolution, the Darwinian take on biological evolution, is as much 19th century materialist philosophy masquerading as science as it is a kind of careful look at the empirical evidence.
I'll get to that in a few minutes, and remind me if I forget. But let's back up and talk about theistic evolution a little bit, and really kind of what you see as the fundamental problems here, particularly with regard to the telos of the world from a Christian point of view and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and so it's important when I can tell you, I just 2 weeks ago was with some theologians, and it took 30 minutes for them to get straight in their minds that there's a difference between saying, well, things have changed over time. So there, it used to be saber-toothed tigers, and there are no longer saber-toothed tigers, things like that. So it's a change over time with respect to the kinds of things that live. The second claim would be common ancestry, that some or all organisms share a common ancestor if you work your way back. And then the third claim is the uniquely or the specifically Darwinian claim, which is that the source not only of this common ancestry is true, but also the source of adaptation is natural selection acting on random variations, and in particular, in the modern sense, acting on random genetic variation. So in other words, the mammalian eye and the heart that pumps and all the kind of amazing adaptations that you see in biology, they're not the result of real design. They're not the result of real purposes in nature. They're the result of this really blind process of natural selection, sifting random genetic mutations and then just preserving those so that over time you end up with these things that look designed, but they're not really designed. They're the result of this blind process and random changes. And here now you get, it's obviously theologically pregnant at the very least, right? Because we're now saying these are the result of this blind process. But also, I think there's really a logical problem here, because the Darwinian claim, and I think I substantiate this in the book, if you just take Darwinists at their word, the claim is that life is the result of a blind and purposeless process. That's a direct quote from one prominent Darwinist that didn't have us in mind. And now the theistic evolutionist or the theistic Darwinist is saying, well, but God really designed this behind the scenes. He's really orchestrating it. Now you've got a logical problem because not even God can direct an undirected process. It just doesn't make any sense. You get one or the other. You can't have both. And so you could say logically, okay, maybe organisms share a common ancestry, but God has guided the process. And then you're taking really what I would call an intelligent design view, which is that purpose and design is a real thing in nature. It does things and you can actually observe it. That's not a Darwinian view. And then, yeah, of course, natural selection explains some things like antibiotic resistance. But the kind of key logical and theological problem, I think, for the theistic Darwinist is that they end up having to say that God directed an undirected process. And that just seems like a non-starter. It's just basically a contradictory logical position, it seems to me.
One of the other things that you pointed out in one of the essays is that the whole idea of theistic evolution fails to deal with the problem of evil. What is that? Explain what that means and why that's a problem.
Well, what's funny is that some Christians that I'll say accommodate Darwinism will say that it actually solves the problem of evil, because if God hasn't directly created, say, major animal groups, or he didn't directly create human beings at the beginning, rather he sort of delegated everything to this blind process of really differential death and survival. So basically almost everything dies, but it kind of slowly creates new things. And they say, so now the kind of evil, or at least natural evil, has been delegated, so it's off God's hands. This is what Francisco Ayala, who was a former Dominican priest, said. Former Dominican means now atheist, of course, but but he also said, but this really seems to kind of solve the theodicy problem. Well, any thinking person that thinks for more than 10 seconds is going to realize this doesn't solve anything, because it's God still ultimately in charge. So he's just delegated it, but he still is responsible as if he had done it directly. So it really doesn't solve anything. And so I just think, look, let's look at the empirical evidence for the explanatory power of natural selection and random genetic mutation. How much can it really explain? What do we know that it can explain, and what are its limits? And when you're even willing to ask that question, there's a heck of a lot of data. It's just that what I found is it's actually really hard to get fellow Christians, including fellow Catholics, even to talk about that. It's like, look, I've already reconciled this in my mind. God's worked it out. I don't want to have arguments with my biology teacher. And so don't bother me with the facts, because I've got this really good synthesis where it all works really well together. This is where I was in college at one point. I didn't want to think about it. I had a friend that pressed me on it. And I said, look, at any one time, whenever you're living, there's some prevailing scientific theory that a lot of smart people believe and that is just wrong, or that is way overextended. And I just think that's what we're dealing with Darwinism. It's just way overextended. It's been oversold. It's mainly maintained itself, I think, because it kind of carries water for atheism. And so it would have been modified, I think, a long time ago, except for the kind of metaphysical water that it's carrying.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, you mentioned, and I want to come back to this point you made about materialism and how, let's just put it that way, how is evolution materialistic in its essence, as you discuss in one of these essays? And first, I talked about this actually on a previous podcast a little bit with Michael Miller a few episodes ago, but why don't you just explain the type of materialism we're talking about, and then why evolution is such?
Yeah, by materialism here, I just mean the kind of the philosophical view that matter is all that matters, right? That at bottom, the fundamental reality is matter, space, time, and energy, and everything derives from that. So rather than God being the primal reality that creates the material universe and the invisible world, it's matter from eternity, as Carl Sagan said. It's the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. That's Sagan's formulation. That's the materialism I'm talking about. It really reached, I think, its high watermark in the 19th century, when scientists could still think that the universe was eternal. And the one area of natural science that seemed to resist our materialist explanation was biology, because you look at the biological world and things just look manifestly designed. It drove people crazy. And what Darwin did more than anything is he came up with a story that is consistent with the materialist creed, because he said, yeah, these things look designed, but it's just the mere appearance of design. It's actually the result of random variation and natural selection. And so this is why the contemporary Darwinist Richard Dawkins said Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. He sort of solves the problem for the atheist. Now, I'm not saying that means that you should ignore all the evidence for natural selection, but you got to realize that from the beginning, it was called into service to kind of complete what people thought of as the materialist case for nature, which then started really falling apart, I think, in the early 20th century. Once we realized the universe had a beginning, it sort of unwound itself. But Darwinism has held on. It's held on longer than Marxism and Freudianism. And I think part of it is because it's partly true. Natural selection explains some things clearly, but also because it seems to be the kind of key plank that holds materialism together, which claims to be based on the public evidence of science. And so it's very tenacious. And so there's all the kind of sociological reasons for Catholic intellectuals to just kind of acquiesce and not think too hard about the subject.
Would you say that one of the reasons why, and this just kind of came to me as you're speaking here, that evolution has kind of continued on and it continues to carry weight is because if it's materialism, if matter is all that matters, then in reality it makes no demands on us, does it? And is that one of the reasons why it's there? I mean, it's convenient in a lot of ways.
Well, it is convenient. And I mean, I would never make this as like it's false because, but I do know that many Darwinists hold on to it precisely because of its sort of moral, the moral license it allows. In fact, Thomas Nagel, the atheist philosopher, admitted this, that it's not just that we sort of don't believe, God exists. We don't want the world to be like that. There have been atheists that have admitted that, look, if there's a God, he would be telling me about my sexual lifestyle and proclivities, and I don't like that, And so you kind of, so what worldview do I need in order to justify my lifestyle? I do think that's back there, and I think ultimately you do have to deal with it. And so my view is what I want to know is I want to be able to make arguments that are persuasive to the rational fence sitter. So the person that's open to persuasion, that's open to the evidence, it's not pre-committed all the way. And I think if a person is that open-minded, that you can make a really persuasive case, one, that there's evidence of purpose in the universe, and two, that the Darwinian mechanism is not very good for explaining anything when you get beyond a species or at the most of the genus stage of life. And beyond that, it just doesn't have any power.
So what's the Catholic position then vis-a-vis evolution? What is it that Catholics should be pointed toward?
This is what makes this frustrating is there's not one place. And so the simplest thing to say, there's not a single Catholic view on evolution broadly construed. And the reason is because the word evolution means several different things.
Right.
As I mentioned, it can mean change over time. It can mean change in the gene frequencies of a population, like light and dark colored peppered moths. It could mean limited common ancestry, universal common ancestry. It can mean a kind of limited Darwinian explanation. Or it can mean this broad, what we'll call the blind watchmaker thesis, which is this claim that all of the biological world and all of its design is the result of this blind and purposeless process. Now, that last one seems obviously to contradict the Catholic faith. I mean, we believe both that God created the world and that he providentially superintends it for his purposes. You don't have to go any farther than the inaugural homily of Pope Benedict in 2005, who said when he first descended to the papacy that we are not the product of a blind and purposeless process of evolution. Each of us is willed and is thought. And so he's, in fact, Benedict, since the 60s, Joseph Ratzinger has been writing about this subject. And so he, of course, directly contradicts this purely materialistic claim. And I think that's just sort of common sense that no faithful Catholic's going to affirm that. So the question is, okay, so how much can Catholics affirm? I think the clearest statement would probably be Pius XII's encyclical Humani Generis in 1950, in which he was dealing with several different issues. But he basically said, okay, we're sort of free to consider the hypothesis that the human body, or at least parts of the human body, might have sort of precursors in the biological world. Nevertheless, it's a Catholic dogma that God has created every soul directly. He didn't say that was true. He just said, well, you can be sort of open to that. And then, of course, John Paul, in a speech, said famously that we should really talk about theories of evolution. There's definitely no requirement for Catholics to be young Earth creationists. And so I would say there's kind of a lot of flexibility as long as you affirm that God created the individual human souls directly, and as long as you affirm God's providence and purposes within the created order. There's a lot of flexibility. And the reality is the church, at least in its official capacity, hasn't spoken at a much more granular level than that, at least at this point.
Has it ever commented directly on Darwin's Origin of Species?
Not well. This is what's odd. It was never added to the index of prohibited books. My friend and colleague, Dominican Father Michael Chabrick, has written a couple of books on this that I think are sort of the definitive books in which he has studied the early church's reception of Darwinism. And if you look at how the church responded right after 1859, at least in various capacities, Darwinism was initially treated as essentially an expression of applied atheism in biology. That was the church's kind of initial response. Things got kind of complicated and muddled, and so it never has boiled down. There's not an encyclical in any case written that explicitly sort of separates all the theses of Darwin's Origin of Species and weighs in favor of some and against others. This is part of the complication, and so unless you dig into the history, it's not exactly clear what's happened. And then I'd say in the last few decades, except for offhand comments by popes here and there, the church has mostly kind of avoided getting too far down in the weeds on it. And I think sometimes that's good. The church doesn't have to weigh in on everything, but I do think a little bit of clarity on some of these things would really be helpful.
What about outside the hierarchical or the hierarchy? Some things more in the Catholic intellectual tradition with guys like Hilaire Belloc or Chesterton. What do these guys have to say about Darwinianism?
Yeah, I mean, Chesterton was perfect on this. And again, in Belloc at the time, right? You got to think about the time in which they were writing. And so after Darwin, he wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, and then the Ascent of Man in 1877. And there was a kind of reception that this just looks like materialism, and that was how a lot of Catholic intellectuals responded to it. Certainly many of my colleagues like Michael Behe, the Catholic biochemist, has been quite critical of it. But there also been a lot of Catholic intellectuals that have done their best to sort of accommodate it. And I think that's what makes it baffling, I think, especially for lay people who just say, well, look, I'm not an expert on biological evolution. And there's this smart Catholic scientist at the local college that tells me there's no problem with it. I deal with people all the time, homeschool parents that tell me this. Well, this smart Orthodox Catholic seems to think it's fine. And I say, well, that's how it's always been. There's always been kind of a disagreement on these kinds of things that has to be hashed out. This is why I spend my time talking about it, is because I think we tend not to think really clearly about this issue, in part because it has such cultural power, and also because it does take a bit of looking at the evidence. But I'm convinced that sort of the effects of Darwinian theory on the culture and on the church are negative enough that it's something that we can't simply punt on. We have to address directly.
So let's pivot then. Let's talk about intelligent design and why you're such a proponent of it and where it kind of fits into this entire framework.
Yeah, I mean, intelligent design is just, think of it as a research program of academics, philosophers, and natural scientists who think there's positive evidence of intelligent design in the universe. So not just that we can make a kind of philosophical case that God created the world, which of course I believe as well, but also that if you look at the evidence of natural science with an open mind, you can find places in which things are really better explained in terms of purpose and design rather than a blind process. So yeah, there are lots of things that are created just by the kind of ordinary course of nature, but if you don't take account of teleology, if you ignore the possibility of design, you'll actually miss a huge chunk of the evidence from natural science. So that's what makes intelligent design somewhat different. It goes a little beyond the kind of traditional idea that we can make theological or theistic arguments for God's existence. We're claiming, well, look, actually the evidence of natural science itself, the stuff that scientists have discovered with their telescopes and microscopes, sometimes we can actually find positive evidence of design in that stuff. Now, to do that, we have to broaden our understanding of what science can talk about, which we think that's fine. I mean, these philosophical questions about the nature of science have never been settled. So we need a broader understanding of science as the search for the best explanation, the search for the truth about the natural world, no holds barred. And then we need kind of reliable methods for teasing out the evidence for design, so that we're not just sort of relying on our intuition. So this thing looks designed, so therefore it must be designed. We need something more rigorous than that. I've been involved in the intelligent design movement for now well over 20 years, have contributed to it with the book The Privileged Planet and some other things, and really have spent a lot of time talking about it in the Catholic context, because a lot of Catholics, again, don't really know what intelligent design is. Sometimes they're told, oh, that's just young earth creationism and Protestant fundamentalism, and then they respond accordingly, when that's just not true. I mean, but design broadly construed is just really the claim that there is empirical evidence for design in the natural world. And that's kind of as far as it goes. And so it doesn't weigh in on these narrower questions about how exactly God created the world, or what the days of Genesis refer to. It's a kind of broader research program. And I should say there are people that are intelligent design theorists that aren't even Christians. They may be theists or they believe in teleology, but that's as far as it goes.
But it seems, in listening to you, at its core, if you're going to go the ID route, that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, Jay, but then you're basically at loggerheads with even theistic evolutionists based on what you talked about before, because there's no telos, there's no goal for creation in the theistic evolutionist position, but there is for intelligent design.
Absolutely, and that's precisely where the conflict is in the debate. It's not even over, say, universal common ancestry, because a person could be like Alfred Russel Wallace, who was actually a contemporary of Darwin's, a co-discoverer of natural selection. He believed in universal common ancestry, but he also thought natural selection didn't explain very much. He thought that God was actively guiding the sort of origin of new organisms and species. I get the impression that that's something like what Pope Benedict believes, but God's really doing stuff. Theistic evolution, at least among most theistic evolutionists, is really theistic Darwinism, in which you just accept the Darwinian package, and then you just kind of put God mysteriously in the background somewhere. And at the very least, what you're saying is that there's no apparent real design in the natural world. And design theorists say, no, in fact, there is. If you look at it with an open mind, there's positive evidence for design. So it's not just that the purposive processes have done something in the world, but we can actually tell that those things have happened. And so that's actually ends up being where the debate is. And that's why people are often baffled. Why are even fellow Christians sometimes so hostile to intelligent design? This is the rub. This is the issue, is that we claim that design does real work, and it can actually be observed in the content of science.
So where do you send people to kind of dig more into this and to really start to wrap their minds around the issues that are at stake here? Where would you point them? I mean, obviously, we got your book, God and Evolution. This is a little bit of a heavier text, right? I mean, who did you write this for, first of all?
I wrote it for general educated Christians, and so it probably does seem to be a heavier text. But there's another volume that some ID folks put together a couple of years ago called Theistic Evolution, and it's about 1,000 pages long.
So
this is actually this is the easy primer. Actually, we define all the terms in this book, and so I really wrote it for like kind of mostly college age Christian reader, because it's not just about Catholics, it's Catholics, Protestants, and Jews that are struggling with this particular issue, not so much wanting to know about the evidence for design, but wanting to know, how do I think about this as a religious believer who believes in God and believes God really does things in the world? That's who the book was written for. And so for people that are interested in that, I always send them to God and Evolution. If they're interested in the evidence for intelligent design, I mean, there are now dozens of books. Steve Meyer's Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, Mike Behe's 3 books, Darwin's Black Box, The Edge of Evolution, and now Darwin Devolves, are all absolutely terrific books that make a positive case for design, and many more. And so in some ways, really the kind of evidence for design and the evidence critiquing Darwinism, that literature is a little bit bigger than the literature in which we integrate evidence for design with theology, just because that's in some ways been a kind of secondary project. But the reason I got into it is that I realized, gosh, there are a lot of fellow Catholics that do not understand what intelligent design theorists are doing and don't recognize that this ought to be something that they're supportive and are helping to contribute to it. Instead, they very often will find themselves critiquing it, I think, for mistaken reasons.
Did I not see, I might have seen this on the stream, I'm not sure, that a pretty prominent Darwinian just, I don't want to say converted, but left that whole mindset. And did he come toward intelligent design, or he just leave Darwinism, or what happened, and who was he?
It's a great question. It's David Galanter, who is a prominent computer scientist at Yale, and in fact, he was one of the victims of the Unabomber. In fact, he was a
Wow.
person who opened up and was injured by the Unabomber. He's a very prominent computer scientist, a religious Jew, but had always been accommodating to Darwinism, just like many Christian intellectuals are, just because he thought the arguments were really strong. This summer, he just came out and said, look, we need to just accept the arguments and the evidence for this are lacking. It's been 150 years, and the theory doesn't work, at least in its most expansive applications. And so he came out as a Darwin skeptic. He said isn't really endorsing intelligent design, though he did say he thought the intelligent design arguments need to be taken seriously because they are serious. And it's funny because a lot of us, we knew this was happening, have covered it and talked about it, but it's gotten massive coverage. And I think it's in part because of just because of his intellectual stature, and it's sort of disturbed people. But this has happened, a few times. Anthony Flew, the famous atheist, right before he died, came out in favor of, endorsed deism, and it was because of arguments for design. And so we see the kind of cracks in this massive structure starting to form. But the social pressure to conform to these things is so intense. I mean, you can endanger your tenure in many cases if you weigh in on this. And so it's really brave, I think, of Galanter to be able to do that. And I think in some ways, being at a place like Yale, you're safer doing things like that. You're more in danger at you'd say a small evangelical college that wants its intellectual respectability, but nobody thinks the creationists are taking over at Yale. So I think that Galanter will probably be fine.
Outside of the academic world, do you see signs that intelligent design is gaining traction, even amongst the laity and just normal Joe and Judy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm constantly encountering people. Weirdly, when I was in France, even a few years ago, I was visiting Notre Dame and went up, this is of course before the fire, and was up in the room where you can see the bell, in the tower. And was standing there, and there was me, and there's one other man happened to be in there at the same time. He looked at me, he goes, "Hey, wait, weren't you in the Privileged Planet?" I mean, this is in Paris, right? And so people are reading these things, and I think most people intuitively, especially most Christians, think God created the world and that has some kind of implication. And so unless they've been really badgered by this stuff, they tend to get this stuff intuitively. And I can say medical doctors and engineers in particular get this stuff really quickly because they tend to know what functioning systems look like and what they do when they don't work right. And so they tend to get design arguments really well. I would say academics in general, people that have PhDs and they're in academic settings, tend to have mental blocks unless they have actually studied openly and honestly the evidence for themselves. They'll tend to still be skeptical.
And on my subscription site, which is Next Level Catholic Academy, this topic, not necessarily intelligent design and evolution, but part of the ripple effect. So Adam and Eve, and who were
Yes.
they, and were there people before Adam and Eve, and all these kinds of odd questions that I never expected to come out of our Q&As. They really, a lot of people gravitate toward these, and this is
Sure.
there's a lot of interest in this, which is why the work that you're doing is obviously very important, and I would have to assume it's just going to gain momentum as time goes by.
I think it is because I actually think, Matthew, that we live at the kind of best time. I mean, in some ways, Catholics, it's hard to say this. We feel like things are falling apart around us. But, God has revealed himself in Scripture and in the teaching authority of the church historically. He's also revealed himself in the book of nature. And, it was only in the 20th century that we knew empirically that the universe had a beginning. It's only in the mid-20th century that we were able to sort of realize that the laws of physics, the constants of physics, had to be very precisely fine-tuned for the existence of any complex life. And it's only much more recently that we understand the kind of mechanisms and the systems inside cells. Darwin thought the cell was a simple homogeneous globule of protoplasm, after all. We're now discovering these wonders of engineering far beyond any kind of engineering that we can imagine as humans. And so that's what's exciting, is that the natural world, it gets to speak. And it's, I think, testifying every day more and more to this reality. That's what makes it exciting for people that are involved in this. I know there are young scientists that deal with it mostly privately and secretly until they get tenure. But I can tell you this isn't going away anytime soon.
Well, it speaks to the fact that what John Paul II talked about, you mentioned it already in Fides et Ratio. There is no fear whatsoever in Catholicism of the truth. And it doesn't
That's
matter
right.
in what discipline you're talking about. It's always going to point back to God. And so we just have to keep seeking after that truth and trust that always it's going to point back to what we already know is true. And
Absolutely.
so for that reason, I commend you for what you're doing, because you're opening the eyes of a lot of different people on some very important issues. And again, I don't think this is going away. It's as people get more disenchanted with their lives and start to turn a little more introspective, and just the general unhappiness, not just in the world at large, but Jay, I mean, you mentioned already
Yeah.
in the church in general. I mean, people just are like, all right, what's going on here? And
I know.
I don't think that the issues that we are facing are unrelated to what it is that we're talking about here.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, I remember this pop song from a few years ago, and I almost hate to quote the lyrics, but they in the song I remember they say, "You and me, baby, ain't nothing like mammals, so let's do it like they do on the Discovery Channel." I mean,
Oh my
that's the
gosh.
lyrics, right? It's like the perfect distillation of
Ugh.
materialism applied to our sexuality. And so this idea that these things can be separated, I mean, the Darwinists all tell us that these things are related. I think it's time that we believe them.
Well, that's great. Where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, you actually go to the Busch Business School at cua.edu, and you can also check out my writings and those of others at the Stream, which is actually stream.org, stream.org.
Yeah, and I encourage people to go check that out. Make it your homepage. There's a lot of great stuff up there, and you don't need to watch the Drudge Report or read that stuff. Go read the stuff that's not just edifying, but incredibly informative as well, and I congratulate you on that.
Thanks. And I should also mention the Discovery Institute website, which has a lot of stuff, both having to do with the God and evolution question, but also evidence for intelligent design, which is at discovery.org.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but is Dr. Ben Weicker part of the
Yes,
Discovery as well? I've had him on
absolutely.
the Art of Catholic. Yeah.
That's right. And he's got a couple of terrific books, including this wonderful book with Jonathan Witt, A Meaningful World, that talks about these things. I think it's one of the most important intelligent design books ever written.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you very much for coming on, and I'd love to have you back again. This is fascinating.
Definitely. Anytime. Good to be with you.
Thank you, Jay.